The Supreme Court chamber is a place where silence is supposed to mean respect. But on this day, the silence felt more like a warning. The marble columns, the velvet drapes, the rows of black-robed justices, all of it seemed designed to remind everyone who held the power. Yet, as Representative Jasmine Crockett took her seat at the witness table, it was clear that power was about to be challenged in a way the court hadn't seen in years. The hearing was supposed to be routine. The Chief Justice, John Roberts, had agreed to an unprecedented public session on the future of voting rights, a move meant to show transparency, but also, some suspected, to reassert the court's authority after months of public criticism. Lawmakers, legal scholars, and civil rights leaders had been invited to testify. Most were expected to offer polite, measured statements. Jasmine Crockett, however, was not most people. Crockett, a first-term Congresswoman from Texas, had built her reputation on refusing to play by the old rules. She was a civil rights attorney who had taken on police departments, state legislatures, and even her own party when she thought they were wrong. She was known for her sharp mind, her sharper tongue, and her refusal to be intimidated by titles or tradition. As she adjusted the microphone, the room seemed to lean in, waiting to see if she would live up to her reputation. Chief Justice Roberts, presiding from the center of the bench, opened the session with a carefully worded statement about the court's commitment to equal justice under law. His tone was measured, almost paternal. He welcomed the witnesses, thanked them for their service, and reminded everyone that the court was not a political body. It was the kind of speech that usually set the tone for a respectful, if uneventful, hearing, but Crockett was not interested in business as usual. When her turn came, she began with a story. "My grandmother was born in a county where black people couldn't vote," she said, her voice steady but full of emotion. She lived long enough to see her granddaughter sworn into Congress, but she also lived long enough to see those rights threatened again. The room was silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. One that demanded attention. Roberts interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "Representative Crockett, we appreciate your personal perspective, but we ask that you focus your remarks on the legal questions before the court." Crockett didn't miss a beat. "Chief Justice, with all due respect, the law doesn't exist in a vacuum. The Constitution was written by people for people. If we ignore the human impact of our decisions, we're not interpreting the law, we're hiding behind it." A ripple of surprise moved through the chamber. It was rare for anyone to push back so directly against the Chief Justice, especially in his own house. But Crockett pressed on. She cited case after case, Shelby County v. Holder, Brnovich v. DNC, even the infamous Bush v. Gore, showing how the court's decisions had real, often devastating, consequences for voters of color. She quoted statistics, legal scholars, and even Roberts' own opinions, weaving them into a narrative that was as compelling as it was unflinching. Roberts tried again to steer her back to the legal framework. "We are here to discuss the constitutionality of federal oversight in state elections," he said, his tone tightening, "not to relitigate past cases." Crockett smiled, but there was steel in her eyes. "With respect, Chief Justice, you can't talk about the future of voting rights without understanding the past. Every time this court has weakened the Voting Rights Act, it's been black and brown voters who've paid the price. That's not just history, that's the present." The other justices watched, some with curiosity, others with thinly veiled discomfort. Justice Sotomayor leaned forward, clearly engaged. Justice Alito scribbled notes, his expression unreadable. The audience, lawyers, journalists, activists, sat on the edge of their seats. Crockett continued, turning her attention to the recent wave of state laws restricting access to the ballot. "We've seen polling places closed, early voting cut, ID requirements tightened, all in the name of election integrity. But the data shows these laws disproportionately impact communities of color. That's not integrity. That's targeted suppression." Roberts interrupted again, this time more forcefully. "Representative Crockett, the court must remain impartial. We cannot allow this hearing to become a political spectacle." Crockett's response was immediate. Impartiality doesn't mean ignoring reality. It means facing it head on. If the court is truly committed to equal justice, then it must acknowledge when its own decisions have enabled discrimination. A murmur ran through the gallery. Crockett's words were being live-tweeted, her quotes already trending. She was doing what few had dared, holding the highest court in the land accountable. In real time, on its own turf, Roberts, perhaps realizing that his attempts to silence her were only making her message stronger, tried a different tactic. Let's return to the question of federal authority. Do you believe Congress has the power to override state election laws? Crockett nodded. Absolutely. The 15th Amendment gives Congress the authority to enforce voting rights. The Supreme Court's job is to uphold that authority, not undermine it. When states use their power to disenfranchise voters, it's Congress's duty to step in. That's not federal overreach. That's the Constitution in action. The exchange was electric. Crockett had not only refused to be silenced, she had exposed the very dynamics the hearing was meant to conceal. The power of the court, the limits of tradition, the real-world impact of legal decisions, all of it was suddenly on display. Raw and undeniable. As the session continued, it was clear that something had shifted. The justices, the audience, even the Chief Justice himself, were no longer in control of the narrative. Jasmine Crockett was, the hearing pressed on, but the energy in the chamber had changed. Crockett's words echoed in the marble, and even the most seasoned legal minds in the room sensed that the usual script had been torn up. Reporters in the gallery exchanged glances, already drafting headlines in their minds. The Chief Justice, for all his composure, looked unsettled. He was used to controlling the tempo, but Crockett had seized it with a mix of legal acumen and lived experience that was impossible to ignore. Justice Kagan, always the pragmatist, leaned in. Representative Crockett, you've made a compelling case about the real-world impact of our decisions. But what would you say to those who argue that federal oversight risks undermining state sovereignty? Crockett met her gaze. Justice Kagan, I respect the principle of federalism, but sovereignty can't be a shield for discrimination. The 14th and 15th Amendments were written precisely because states abused their power. When states use their authority to block citizens from the ballot box, it's not just Congress's right, it's Congress's responsibility to act. The Supreme Court should be a backstop for democracy, not a bystander. Justice Gorsuch, skeptical, pressed further. But isn't there a risk that federal standards become a one-size-fits-all solution, ignoring local context? Crockett nodded. That's a fair concern. But the answer isn't to do nothing. The answer is to set minimum standards that protect fundamental rights while allowing states to innovate above that floor. The Voting Rights Act did exactly that for decades. It didn't prevent states from running their own elections. It prevented them from running roughshod over voters' rights. Roberts, trying to regain control, interjected. Representative Crockett, you've referenced the Voting Rights Act repeatedly. But the court's role is to interpret the law, not to make it. Isn't it Congress's job to update the act if it's out of date? Crockett's reply was swift. Absolutely, Chief Justice. But the court's job is to interpret the law in a way that honors its purpose. When the court gutted Section 5 in Shelby County, it didn't just interpret the law, it rewrote the rules. Congress can and should act, but the court must recognize the real-world consequences of its decisions. Otherwise, we're left with rights on paper and barriers at the polls. A hush fell over the room. Crockett's critique was bold, but it was grounded in precedent and principle. She wasn't just challenging the court. She was challenging the very idea that legal reasoning could be separated from lived reality. Justice Sotomayor, visibly moved, asked Representative Crockett, "What would you say to the young people watching this hearing who feel their voices don't matter?" Crockett's voice softened, but her conviction deepened. "I'd tell them that democracy is a fight, not a gift. Every right we have was won by people who refused to be silent. The court's decisions matter, but so do the voices of those who demand justice. Don't let anyone, no matter how powerful, convince you that your vote, your story, or your future doesn't count." The audience, usually reserved in such settings, responded with a quiet but unmistakable wave of approval. Even some of the justices seemed to take note. Roberts, sensing the momentum slipping, tried to pivot. Let's discuss the practicalities. You've argued for restoring preclearance requirements, but critics say that's an outdated remedy for a different era. How do you respond? Crockett didn't hesitate. The tactics may have changed, but the goal is the same: to suppress the vote. Preclearance worked because it forced transparency and accountability. If states aren't trying to discriminate, they have nothing to fear from oversight. The only people who oppose sunlight are those with something to hide. Justice Barrett, measured and precise, asked, "But how do you ensure that federal oversight doesn't become politicized?" Crockett answered, "By making the process transparent, data-driven, and subject to judicial review. Oversight isn't about partisanship, it's about protecting the foundation of our democracy. If we can't agree that every eligible citizen should be able to vote, then we've lost sight of what this country is supposed to stand for." The Chief Justice, perhaps realizing that Crockett was not going to be boxed in, tried one last time to assert his authority. "Representative Crockett, we appreciate your passion, but the court must remain above the political fray." Crockett's response was measured, but unyielding. "Chief Justice, justice isn't neutral when neutrality means ignoring injustice. The court's legitimacy depends on its willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. If the law is used to silence the vulnerable, then the law itself becomes complicit." The room was silent again, but this time it was a silence of reckoning. Crockett had not only exposed the limits of the court's traditional approach, she had forced the justices and the country to confront the gap between legal theory and lived experience. As the hearing drew to a close, Roberts offered a final, carefully worded statement about the importance of civility and respect for institutions. But the words felt hollow. The real story was already being written outside the chamber, in headlines, tweets, and conversations across the country. Crockett gathered her papers, thanked the committee staff, and walked out of the Supreme Court with her head held high. She had come to speak truth to power, and she had done exactly that. The marble columns, the velvet drapes, the black robes, they were still there. But for one afternoon, the power in the room had shifted. As she stepped onto the courthouse steps, reporters swarmed her, microphones thrust forward. "Representative Crockett, do you think you changed any minds today?" one asked. Crockett smiled. "I didn't come here to change minds. I came here to tell the truth. Sometimes that's enough to change everything." The aftermath of the hearing was immediate and electric. News outlets ran with the story, some hailing Crockett as a new voice for democracy, others warning that she had broken decorum in the nation's highest court. But the public response was clear. People were hungry for someone who would speak plainly, challenge authority, and refuse to let tradition be used as a shield for injustice. Clips of Crockett's testimony went viral. On social media, hashtags like #CrockettExposesEverything and #TruthToPower trended for days. Civil rights groups issued statements of support, while law students and young activists shared her words as inspiration. Even some legal scholars who had once been skeptical of outsider voices in the court's chambers admitted that Crockett had raised questions the justices could no longer ignore. In the days that followed, Crockett's office was inundated with messages. Some were from young people who had never seen themselves reflected in the halls of power. Others were from seasoned lawyers who admitted that her testimony had forced them to rethink their own assumptions about the law. One email from a retired judge read simply, "Thank you for reminding us what justice is supposed to mean." But not everyone was pleased. Conservative commentators accused Crockett of grandstanding, of turning a legal hearing into a political rally. Some members of Congress grumbled that she had embarrassed the institution. Even a few of her own party's leaders, wary of rocking the boat, privately wondered if she had gone too far. Crockett, for her part, stayed focused. She returned to her district, holding town halls and listening sessions, determined to keep the conversation going. At one event, a high school student asked her if she was afraid to speak so boldly in front of the Supreme Court. Crockett smiled. "I wasn't afraid," she said. "I was prepared." There's a difference. Meanwhile, the policy debate she had ignited took on new life. Lawmakers who had once dismissed federal voting rights protections as settled law now found themselves fielding questions from constituents who wanted to know what they were doing to protect the vote. A bipartisan group in the House began drafting new legislation to restore and strengthen the Voting Rights Act. Citing Crockett's testimony as a catalyst in legal circles, Crockett's performance became a case study. Professors assigned her testimony in constitutional law classes, asking students to analyze not just her legal arguments, but her rhetorical strategy and her ability to connect precedent to lived experience. One professor at Yale wrote, "Crockett's approach is a reminder that the law is not just a set of rules, but a tool for justice. Her insistence on centering real people in the conversation is exactly what our legal system needs." The Supreme Court, too, felt the ripple effects. While the justices did not comment publicly, insiders reported that the hearing had sparked unusually frank discussions behind closed doors. Some clerks noted that the justices were more attuned to the real-world impact of their decisions, more cautious about dismissing the human cost of legal abstractions. Chief Justice Roberts, for his part, maintained his public composure. But those who knew him best said he was privately unsettled. He had prided himself on keeping the court above the political fray, on maintaining the institution's legitimacy through careful, incremental decisions. But Crockett had exposed the limits of that approach. She had shown that legitimacy is not just about process, but about outcomes, about whether the law actually delivers on its promise of justice. As the weeks passed, the story continued to grow. Crockett was invited to speak at universities, legal conferences, and civil rights gatherings. She used every platform to hammer home the same message: democracy is not a spectator sport. If you want justice, you have to fight for it every day in every room, no matter who's sitting at the head of the table. Her words resonated far beyond Washington. In Georgia, a group of voting rights activists launched a campaign called Crockett's Call, urging young people to register and vote in local elections. In Texas, where Crockett had built her career, community leaders organized forums to discuss the future of voting rights. Using her testimony as a starting point, even in Congress, the impact was undeniable. Lawmakers who had once been content to let the courts handle voting rights now realized that the fight was theirs as well. Crockett's willingness to challenge the highest court in the land had given others permission to do the same. The old boundaries between law and politics, between tradition and progress, suddenly seemed less fixed. But for Crockett, the work was just beginning. She knew that one hearing, no matter how powerful, was not enough to change the system. She continued to push for legislative action, meeting with allies and skeptics alike, always insisting that the conversation stay focused on the people most affected by the court's decisions. At a press conference marking the introduction of the new voting rights bill, Crockett stood alongside colleagues from both parties. "This isn't about me," she said. "It's about every American who's ever been told their voice doesn't matter. It's about making sure the law serves the people, not the other way around." As the cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, Crockett remained calm. She had faced the Supreme Court and refused to be silenced. Now, she was determined to make sure that no one else would be either. The months that followed saw a shift, not just in policy, but in the national conversation. Crockett's testimony became a touchstone, a reminder that courage in the face of power can change the terms of debate. In classrooms, students wrote essays about her refusal to be silenced. In community centers, activists replayed her words as a rallying cry. Even in the halls of Congress, the old guard found themselves challenged by a new generation unwilling to accept. "That's just how it's always been," as an answer, the new voting rights bill, inspired in part by Crockett's stand, moved through committee with unusual speed. Lawmakers who had once hesitated now spoke openly about the need for federal protections, citing not just legal precedent but the lived realities of their constituents. The bill's preamble quoted Crockett directly: "Impartiality is not an excuse for inaction. Justice demands that we see and act on the truth." Chief Justice Roberts, for all his efforts to maintain the court's distance from politics, could not ignore the impact. Legal analysts noted a subtle shift in the court's language. More references to real-world consequences, more acknowledgement of the burdens faced by marginalized voters. While the court's decisions remained cautious, the conversation had changed. Crockett had forced the justices and the country to reckon with the gap between principle and practice. For Jasmine Crockett, the journey was both personal and political. She continued to travel her district, listening to stories, gathering ideas, and reminding people that democracy is a living thing, fragile, imperfect, but worth fighting for. At a town hall in Houston, a young woman approached her, tears in her eyes. "You made me believe my voice matters," she said. Crockett hugged her and replied, "It does. And so does your vote. Never let anyone take that from you." Asterisk, as the sun set on another long day in Washington, Crockett walked the steps of the Capitol, her head high. She knew the fight was far from over. But she also knew that, for one unforgettable moment, she had exposed the truth at the highest level, and that truth, once spoken, could not be silenced.